I'm Marc Sidwell. My guests today are Dominic Pino from the National Review Institute. He's on the line from the US state of Virginia. And in London, Reem Ibrahim from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome both. With last week's so-called Liberation Day, President Donald Trump introduced sweeping tariffs that decisively upended more than a century of US-led trade liberalization. In response, global markets are continuing to plunge. Economists fear long-lasting damage and a US recession are on the cards. Dominic, with trillions already wiped off the US stock market, are we starting to see signs of concern even among the president's most fervent supporters?
Yeah, you say wiped off the stock markets. I think we're supposed to say it's liberated from the stock markets. This was one of the biggest sell-offs in U.S. history. I saw something suggesting that we haven't had a three-day stretch this bad since about the 1980s. So this was truly a massive shift. Now, obviously, these intraday changes can always be recovered just as quickly as they were lost. But the U.S. stock market has been underperforming European stock markets since Trump's election. And so that longer-term signal, I think, means a lot more. And we got to remember, of course, that these are price signals. This is actual people's money on the line. And so they pay a price for being wrong. And that's different than, economic commentators, people like you and me talking on a podcast, right? If we're wrong about something, we don't immediately face financial consequences for it, but people trading stocks do, and so they have a lot of really good incentives to be right about this. And if it was true that the Trump administration has created a plan that will have short-term negative effects in order to have long-term positive effects, which is what their argument is, they say, we're going to face some higher prices in the short term, but in the long term, American manufacturing will come back and will be stronger and the economy will be better and there'll be better paying jobs and all the rest of this. If that's really true, then the stock market would respond positively to that because the stock market does look at long-term future expectations as part of the price of a stock. So the fact that these keep going down and that they keep going down in industries such as consumer staples, right? This isn't volatile. This isn't volatile sectors like energy or like technology. It's affecting everything all the way down to consumer staples, which are usually pretty stable. So it's definitely not a good sign.
Do you think there's a risk that people in the stock market, as you say, are sort of incentivized to get it right? But do you think there's a sense in which they may be underpricing how bad this is? Like people are still optimistic about Trump. They think, well, this is a negotiating stance. But there's some evidence that he's really quite committed to this as a policy. Do you think that it may be worse than people in the markets are thinking?
I definitely think that's possible, Mark. And the evidence for that is that the fact that there was a big sell-off in the last few days suggests that they were being too optimistic previously because there was a smaller but still significant sell-off about a month ago, and Trump has been saying that these tariffs were coming for a month. So this wasn't new information that was coming in. It was just a confirmation, like, oh my gosh, he's actually doing what he said he was going to do. And that shock is what is really causing the sell-off. If it was just the existence of these tariffs, then the sell-off would have happened a month ago when he announced that they were going to happen. So I do think they have been underestimating how bad it would be. And as far as it being a negotiating tool, it depends on who you talk to. My colleague Audrey Fahlberg at National Review did some really good reporting, trying to talk to a couple of different people in the administration and a couple of people in Congress. And most of what Congress is saying is they're saying, yeah, this is a negotiating tool, and this has been a line that Republicans have been using for a while because these members of Congress know better. They know that this is bad economic policy, but they also know that politically it's very, very damaging for them to question Donald Trump. And so the sort of middle ground that they've created for themselves is, oh, this must be a negotiating tool. But if you talk to some people in the White House, they will tell you, no, this is not a negotiating tool. This is the new economic order, and we're doing this on purpose, and we want it to be permanent, and we want it to raise revenue over 10 years. And we want to use that revenue over 10 years to pay for other stuff. Now, if it's a negotiating tool that's going to get removed, it's not going to raise any revenue. So, the statements from the people that are actually making this policy, because you got to remember this is all coming from the White House. Congress is not involved in this at all. It's all unilaterally being done by the president. Uh, that suggests that actually this is not a negotiating tool, and if they change their mind later, that would undermine both of those things, right? So it's a very bad spot both politically and economically.
Well, you mentioned Congress there, and of course, in some sense, Congress should have the power over taxation to intervene here. I mean, what do you think the chances are of Congress actually stepping in and trying to rein in sort of Trump's presidential power grab from the White House here?
I'm not actually very optimistic about that happening because Congress had a chance to pass legislation like this previously and they didn't take it. And it would have been easier politically. So in the US, the president is elected in November. He doesn't come into office until the end of January. And so there's a span of a couple months in between that time when the losing president is still in power and Congress is still in session. And you could pass a law that president could sign. And there was an effort to do just this about the tariff power. Congress introduced legislation to do this, and it didn't go anywhere, and it didn't even make it to Joe Biden's desk. He didn't even have a chance to sign it. It would have been an opportunity for him to weaken the power of the presidency. But the problem is both parties, right now anyway, want the presidency to be strong. And so they don't take opportunities to do this because they think, well, next time we're in power, I want to have those powers for myself. And it's a very unhealthy situation we have. The Constitution is extremely clear that the tariff power resides with Congress and not with the president. And yet these laws have been signed, and they initially contained something called a legislative veto, which basically said that the president could introduce a tariff measure, and he had a span of time, I believe it was 30 days or 60 days or something like that, in which he could do that. But then Congress would have the power by a simple majority vote to undo it. The Supreme Court ruled in the 1980s that that's unconstitutional because it's constraining. It would be the equivalent of passing legislation without the president signing it, which the Constitution doesn't allow. And so now there's a fundamental imbalance in these laws that wasn't there before, which basically says that the only way to constrain the president for Congress is to actually have a law that the president then has to sign. So you have to assume he's going to veto it. And that means that the new threshold is not a simple majority. Now it's 2/3. 2/3 to override the president's veto. That would mean about 20 out of the 53 Republican senators would have to vote for it. And it would mean about 75, 74, something like that, out of the 218 Republican representatives would have to vote for it. And that is a very, very tall ask. Now, I think it should be obvious, and it should become obvious over time that these tariffs are a really bad idea. And maybe then enough Republicans will man up and understand that this needs to be done. But right now, there's just no appetite to counter the president on this stuff.
Yeah, it seems extraordinary. You would think there would be some sort of incentive on Trump to spread the blame a little. I mean, but he seems to be, for the moment at least, enjoying the fact that he's the one who really owns these tariffs. But that doesn't seem to be constraining him. Perhaps as the economic consequences become more evident, that may change. Reem, if I can bring you in. How hard do you think these tariffs, this new era that Trump has plunged us into, are going to hit the UK?
It's really, really interesting, actually, especially thinking about the reaction that the UK have had. I mean, the reaction has sort of been mixed across the board. The UK government seemed to be sort of declaring this end of globalization, the end of the era, which I think is interesting. I mean, it comes down to very simple economic principles that no individual can produce everything that they consume, which means that no family can produce everything they consume. And that same principle applies to entire nations. No country can produce absolutely everything that they consume, and nor should they seek to, because any attempt to achieve that kind of ideal autarky only serves to make their own consumers poorer. Now, I do think it really does depend on what the UK government do in response. If the UK government are to attempt to match that, so we already imposed that 10% tariff, if we are to increase that, or we are to become even more protectionist than we already are, then that's only going to hurt British consumers even more. I do think what's interesting is one of the first people that, or first organisations or groups that came out asking the government to impose retaliatory tariffs on the US were the steel unions. Now, this was back when Trump actually announced the steel tariffs against Canada. Now, I think what's interesting about that is, of course, the UK steel industry is pretty small. It's pretty much entirely reliant on government subsidies, and we don't really sell much steel to the US anyway. So it's really interesting as to why that might be the case. And I think it's probably because Canada are going to have huge amounts of sort of steel supply that they're going to then have to increase the global supply of steel overall. And I think that the steel unions in the UK were worried about the global price of steel plummeting, and therefore meaning that British steel was entirely uncompetitive. I mean, it is uncompetitive anyway. It wouldn't exist if it wasn't for those government subsidies. But it's interesting that there are particular groups that are going to be lobbying governments specifically for protection. And we see this happen time and time again across the board. So whether or not this really hurts the UK will depend on how the UK government respond. We will probably see the steel industry really suffer as a result unless those retaliatory tariffs are being imposed. Again, it's not necessarily the case that they're competitive anyway, so perhaps the UK shouldn't have a steel industry. I think what's interesting about this globally, though, is that in the UK, both the political right and the political left seem to be outraged by what the US are doing, but still of the view that we should impose retaliatory tariffs. Now, we have to be very clear about the economic consequences of that. Anytime you impose a tariff or on imports into your own country, you are hurting your own consumers. So whilst it might seem as though the macho thing to do is for Keir Starmer to respond by imposing further protectionism, in reality that will only serve to hurt British consumers. We should, in my view, pursue a policy of unilateral free trade. Don't care what other countries do. It doesn't matter what other countries do, because ultimately our own consumers are going to reap the benefits of freer trade.
In the US, a staggering 99% of footwear is imported. Brands like Nike, which is already paying a 26% duty on products made in Vietnam, now face a new 46% tariff on top. It's one thing to watch the trade drama unfold on TV, but when price hikes start hitting the high street for American consumers, is that when the political backlash really begins, do you think?
I've got to say, so I'm in the US at the moment, and I'm always so shocked whenever I'm here about how expensive groceries are. And that's just an everyday occurrence in which you see across the board things that are increasingly more expensive. Now, again, no individual or no country or no family can produce everything they consume, and the US has largely been successful economically as a result of being able to import various different products from across the world. And it comes down to very basic economic principles. I mean, Adam Smith, in his 1776 Wealth of Nations, argued that through the specialization of labor, you're able to achieve much more efficient production, and therefore you're able to increase the choice of products that consumers have, and indeed the efficiency at which they're produced. Now, if other countries are able to produce things more efficiently, or indeed one part of the production process more efficiently, that's Adam Smith's pin factory. If they're able to produce it more efficiently, then that means that often we're able to get things at a lower cost. And so that freer trade ultimately results in the alleviation of poverty. It means that many families across the world are able to then access cheaper goods and able to feed their families, clothe their families, and indeed build shelter in ways that are that weren't previously possible. Now, in reality, these tariffs are absolutely, as you outlined, going to hit American consumers economically. The fact that so much of American goods are produced abroad because of cheaper labour costs, they might have a comparative advantage in those areas. So it means that those particular goods are so much more cheaper when they are produced abroad. That will hit American consumers. Politically, I think that will matter. And I actually think that there might be a bit of a reflectionist positive here, especially for us free traders. when the economic consequences of protectionism are so clearly going to be seen over the next few years, I think there might be a huge backlash, and hopefully, I am hoping at least, a huge backlash towards then a sort of global political climate that pursues more free trade. Whether or not that actually happens in reality is maybe me being a bit naively optimistic. But I think it would be interesting to see if the real economic consequences of that will happen. Now, there have been a couple of studies that quite a few American economists have been pointing out. There are a couple from the Cato Institute that have been saying, well, there are these multivariate studies. There's one I'm thinking of that looked at 151 countries over the last 50 years. And in every single case, the imposition of tariffs or imposition of quotas or any kind of protectionist policy has resulted in GDP shrinking in some capacity. So it has a genuine impact on the size of the pie, and that is genuinely felt every day by American consumers, and that will be felt over the next few years. Well, only time will tell if it then results in a backlash towards more free trade.
Well, let's hope so, and we might come back to that in a moment. Dominic, I mean, do you think that the true believers in MAGA are going to take the medicine of higher prices at the grocery store, or is that going to turn them away from Trump?
Well, one of the political realities about Donald Trump seems to have been over the last 8-10 years now that he's got a base of about 35% of the American population that will support him no matter what he does. 35% is not a majority, but it's a lot of people, and his ability to win elections is determined by how much he can add to that 35%. And so he was able to add just barely enough twice in order to win, and then once he wasn't able to and lost. And then we see Republicans across the board having to deal with some of those similar dynamics because a lot of times, as the president does, so does the rest of Congress and other Republicans running for office elsewhere. And so what will be interesting to see is if for the first time this 35% will shrink. Trump has done a lot of crazy stuff that that was very unpopular with the majority of Americans, but this 35% has sort of stuck with him. But up until now, it hasn't meant higher prices for them in their day-to-day lives. The shenanigans on January 6th, 2021, for example, very bad stuff. Didn't raise prices. This is a different kind of thing. And if there's one thing that Americans can count on Republicans to do, Republicans are very unreliable, very flighty on all sorts of issues, but if there's one thing you can count on them to do, it's to not raise taxes. And not only has Trump raised taxes with these tariffs, it is delaying and forestalling the passage of a tax bill in Congress. Basically the entire individual income tax code in the United States expires on December 31st of this year, and Republicans will need to extend the Trump tax cuts that he passed in 2017. That process is already behind schedule. It will probably take them until December to pull it off. It took them until December to pull it off in 2017 when they did it the first time. And Trump is burning through political capital on these crazy tariff ideas that would be much better spent extending the tax cuts. So we could get to the end of the year and be in a situation where Republicans need to work with Democrats in order to pass a tax bill, in which case they will probably have to compromise with some tax increases. That's not a good situation either. So we've already raised taxes with the tariffs. We could raise taxes again at the end of the year, and at that point, what's the Republican Party for? If they're just going to be raising taxes, using a lot of the same arguments that Democrats do, by the way, that would be a significant change in the composition of American politics, and that could start eating away at that 35% floor that Trump seems incapable of going below.
I suppose, Dominic, just to add to that quickly, something that Trump may, at least in his rhetoric, be hoping for. I don't know how much he expects this in reality, but there is some talk there about the reshoring of manufacturing to America. And of course, that might be a source of votes for him if he started to see people who felt that some of those industrial jobs were coming back. Do you think there's any chance of that actually happening to an extent that might support him, or is that just pie in the sky?
I think it's very pie in the sky. I mean, even if their rhetoric is correct, which I don't think it is, but even if it is correct, that's a process that's going to take, at least 5 years, right? It's not going to be felt, certainly not going to be felt before the midterm elections in 2026. Very unlikely to be felt by 2028 when the next presidential election is. So I don't see that happening.
Right. And Reem, I mean, one possible upside for the UK that some people are talking about is that we may see some cheaper goods here because there might be, supply chains are looking to reroute themselves. They don't want to send things to the US anymore. The economics don't work out. So maybe they end up coming to the UK. Do you think there's some possible upside for the UK in that?
Yes, I think it all depends on how the UK government do end up responding. Over the last few weeks, there have been some rumours about that, and Sir Keir Starmer has said that he's going to vow. I think he vowed to shelter British businesses from any of the storms. So it does really depend on whether or not the UK government do impose retaliatory tariffs. That being said, I think when it comes to raw materials, things like steel, things like raw metals, I think there could be a real interest in selling a lot of that product to the EU and indeed potentially to the UK, especially those countries that have been hit the hardest by those kind of production chains as well. It could also, I mean, when it comes to things like steel, it could come at quite a good time where the UK government are attempting to sort of deregulate and potentially open up the planning system. We've got a huge housing crisis in the UK, and so potentially that could come at quite a nice time where our own demand for those kinds of materials are increasing at the same time. One thing I just want to pick up on that Dominic said, I think is so interesting when you're talking about the Republican Party and the fact that what are they there for if not to decrease taxes or indeed to ensure that tax increases don't happen. And I feel it almost as though you're talking about the Conservative Party in the UK. There are so many parallels. The fact that effectively on the right in the UK there has been that kind of question about whether or not, well, effectively, what does it mean to be a conservative, especially when under conservative governments we face the highest tax burden since the Second World War, almost no economic growth, and a lot of that as a result of the general heavy-handedness of the state. And what's interesting about the two parallels there is the question of economics seems to be sort of at the back foot a little bit. I mean, I think that culture and questions of immigration seem to be at the forefront, and questions of economics are taken less seriously. So when something like this happens, when the US government are imposing huge swathes of tariffs, that does mean that it shifts the economics ever so slightly and increases its importance. Whether or not it will then realise that way politically, I think is an open question, especially when we're thinking about the domestic politics in the UK. I mean, whether or not things like how the UK government responds to Trump's tariffs will be more important than how they respond to the immigration question, I think is still quite up in the air.
If we rewind to the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan led a transatlantic crusade against international socialism, fast forward from that to today, the picture is much less rosy. Higher taxes, rising migration, growing disillusionment among working voters. But echoing Trump's protectionism won't fix liberalism's crisis. It'll only make it worse, as we've been discussing. And as CapX's Joseph Dinich put it last week, sticking with what we know works is the way that Britain can once again point the way to prosperity. Reem, do you think there's a way that the UK, at least, even if America is stuck with this protectionist policy for a while, can find a sort of liberal free trade way to respond? Jeremy Hunt was talking a little bit over the weekend about creating sort of Singapore on Thames. Do you think there's a way for the UK to lead the way on this in response?
Potentially. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether or not those particular lobby groups end up responding to the government, and whether or not the government actually themselves, I mean, if Sir Keir Starmer can have effectively the guts to resist those kind of calls for protectionism, then we definitely could. We've got to remember, though, the UK is so much smaller than the US. We can afford protectionism significantly less than the US government can. In the US, there are huge swathes of different production chains that basically mean there are some parts of protectionism, elements of protectionist policies that hit American consumers a little bit less than they would in the UK. We are a small island that absolutely cannot produce everything that we consume on a daily basis. And so that that just genuine economic reality, that difference is really important. We can't be protectionist nationalists like our American counterparts can, or at least significantly less so. So I think that's an important point to raise. There's also the sort of the domestic politics of this, right? If the Labour government are particularly concerned with trade unions and those, particularly with those manufacturing sectors, if those industries feel as though they're going to be destroyed by free trade or by competition on a global scale, they will be calling for the government to protect them. And we also know that this government, at least more so than previous governments, are going to be more susceptible to those calls from particular unions. So there is that to consider. I think that Sir Keir Starmer, more than other Labour leaders, are more likely to resist those calls and those political pressures. But it's certainly something to consider. Now, if the UK government are smart about this and they resist those calls, they're very good at talking about lots of things and using a lot of rhetoric, but not doing it in reality. If they talk about protecting industries, but actually in reality they sort of hold fire, then potentially we could see the UK actually opening ourselves up to more free trade. I mean, we're thinking about various different free trade agreements. The CPTPP is one in which we are going to be seeing huge advances, especially post-Brexit. The fact that after Brexit, we've seen the fact that the government have effectively reimposed a lot of those protectionist policies. My favourite example is Moroccan tomatoes. I'm half Moroccan, so in the UK we have a completely different Moroccan tomato seasons to Morocco, and yet we still impose tariffs and quotas on Moroccan tomatoes because it was a legacy of our membership of the European Union. So it's just one example of low-hanging fruit, I suppose, that we could seek to change. It really does depend on what that domestic politics looks like. The real golden egg here would be a free trade agreement with the US, who are our largest trading partners. But although I suspect that will only be possible if the UK do resort to 0% tariffs immediately. And again, I think that really what we should be doing is pursuing a policy of unilateral free trade and just seeing what everybody else does by consequence.
Yes, I mean, the problem notoriously about a free trade agreement between the UK and the US is actually not so much often the US's intransigence as our own unwillingness to open up our industries and their complaints about chlorinated chicken and all the rest of that. I mean, Dominic, trying to find, again, some kind of optimism in the mess that we're in. I have seen a Gallup poll that was suggesting that even as politicians are becoming more anti-trade, the public are actually becoming more pro-trade, which is some sort of optimism, perhaps. I mean, do you think that there is a sort of backlash that builds up the fact that this is, going to make people poorer, going to hurt the economy, going to make prices higher? Means that the chances for free trade to come back as like a positive thing that people believe in again could happen over time?
Yeah, I think it's possible. The polling does show that this stuff's unpopular. So if you just ask sort of generic questions about tariffs, you can kind of get to a 50-50 spot. But when you start making it concrete, the support goes down. And so now that we have this very concrete, real policy in effect, you'll see that the support for it has been decreasing. And yeah, there was this Gallup poll that showed over time. It asked some kind of generic question like, is free trade an opportunity, or is international trade an opportunity for growth, or is it a threat to domestic industry? And the percentage of people that said it was an opportunity for growth has been trending up actually for many years, and it's been completely disconnected from what politicians have been doing, because both parties in the United States have been becoming more protectionist over the last several years. And back in the 1990s, which was supposed to be sort of like the neoliberal globalist golden age when everybody was supportive of free trade, actually there were a lot more people that saw free trade as a threat back then than see it now. So I think politicians are very off base about this, but they understand that protectionism helps them to benefit certain interest groups, like you were saying. And so one of the things that is slightly encouraging to me is that, in the past, in the other Anglosphere countries, not the UK, not the US, but in the other Anglosphere countries, it has actually been the left-wing party, the center-left party, that makes market reforms when things get too bad. So you had Paul Keating in Australia, you had Roger Douglas in New Zealand, you had Jean Chrétien in Canada, and all three of those were in the center left, the Liberal or the Labor Party in those places. And they're the ones who adopted responsible budgets. They're the ones who adopted freer, deregulated economies. They're the ones who privatized a lot of public sector businesses. And they did it not because they ideologically wanted to, but because they realized that it was actually the only thing to do. They hit something like a balance of payments crisis or something like that, and they realized, okay, we have to liberalize, and they did, and it worked. And in those places, they've been very successful. And so the problem though is that in the United States, it's just nearly impossible for me to see the Democratic Party having some kind of awakening in that way, because right now, the politicians that are doing the best for the Democrats are the further left ones. People like Bernie Sanders, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and they're not at all predisposed to this. They think the answer is more government, more regulation, and more government spending. And so it's not a good spot. And this is where Republicans need to be the voice of sanity. That's why people vote for Republicans. It's so that they're not crazy on economic issues. There's lots of other things people don't like about Republicans, but the one thing that they do count on is that you're not going to do anything crazy with the economy. You're not going to pass a $2 trillion spending bill for no reason like Joe Biden did. But instead, we're getting economic insanity of a different variety from the Republicans, and that's not good for America. It's not good for our politics.
No, indeed. And we have to hope, perhaps, at least in the UK, as Reem was saying, that Keir Starmer on the left with the Labour Party is going to listen to sanity and try and find a way through that isn't too protectionist in response. Thank you so much to Reem Ibrahim and to Dominic Pino. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. This enormous issue will continue to play out, and we must hope this isn't quite the end of globalization, but certainly a traumatic event with lots of movement still to come. Make sure you subscribe to our daily email briefings. Go to capx.co, that's capx.co, and The Capitalist will be back next week. I'm Marc Sidwell. Goodbye.